This video will discuss major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder is one of the most common disorders that you will work with as a mental health counselor. Anxiety disorders and depressive disorders are considered to be the most common. So it's very important um, that we become comfortable with being able to um, recognize the depressive symptoms as they're different from other symptoms and beginning the discussion on how to treat these disorders. So I think that, at this point in your education and just life, you probably have a decent understanding of what general depression looks like. One of my pet peeves is when someone says that they have depression or diagnosed with depression. That's not enough information, because if you look at the screen, there are four major types of depressive disorder. And then depression is a symptom in many other disorders and other categories as well. So, sorry, that pop-up's going to aggravate me. I hope it doesn't keep doing that. um, so it's important to know exactly how to determine what kind of depression the client is having. So a common symptom, of course, in all of these disorders is depression, but not just any depression. It is a um, depression that is described as sadness, um, a general pessimism. So they're those people that see the glass half empty instead of the glass half full. They have little or no sense of hope for themselves or the future. So these clients are generally down on themselves, so sometimes low self esteem. Um, they just don't have interest in doing things for fun. Um, One way that we use to describe the depressive disorders is the character Eeyore on Winnie the Pooh. He's the guy that says, "Would somebody please pin my tail back on?" He's very down all the time. Nothing really gets him excited. He has one tone, and it's usually a very depressive tone. So that is the basic symptom that we're talking about today. And depending on the level of severity of that depression symptom and what other symptoms go along with this core symptom of depression, then that's how we choose which actual clinical disorder that the client should be diagnosed with. Okay, so first in the DSM is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, but I think this video needs to be dedicated solely to major depressive disorder. It is one of the most common disorders that you will see, and it's very important to make sure that we have the concept of this disorder correct. Okay, so first thing is to understand the spirit, and you've heard me say that a lot, but all of these disorders have spirit, and it's very important that we understand the spirit of major depressive disorder, because that is really what separates it from all of the other disorders in the DSM that contain depression as a symptom. So if you look on page 160, second to put my glasses on. I don't know why the DSM has to be written in such small letters, but it does. Okay, so page 160 in the DSM, at the very bottom, you see the diagnostic criteria. First thing, when we're thinking and conceptualizing a diagnosis, we get a lay of the land. And with that lay of the land, we see that there's no diagnostic code at the top of the diagnostic criteria box. So that should clue us in immediately that with this disorder, we're going to have to choose a subtype before we can create a formal diagnosis, which includes the code. Because if you look on page 162, you will see a chart with code numbers. So this is a little confusing, and major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder are the two most confusing disorders to find the code number for, because you have to figure out how the fancy chart works. Okay, so let's talk about this first, because that really does help us conceptualize um, how to diagnose with major depressive disorder. Okay, so first thing, if you look on the screen right now, it says that the client must have 5 or more of the 9 symptoms listed for at least 2 weeks. Okay, and we'll talk about what's in the parentheses later. Well, there's a typo. One of the parentheses I need to add another one. Okay, so what this is saying is, first of all, depression in major depressive disorder is not constant. So if you see a client that is depressed every day, all the time, that is not major depressive disorder. The spirit of major depressive disorder is that it comes in waves. It comes in, we call them episodes, major depressive episodes. And those episodes is what the diagnostic criteria in front of you is for. So the major depressive episode has to occur for at least 2 weeks. Okay, so if the client has all of these symptoms, if they've only been going on for less than 2 weeks, it's not considered a major depressive episode, and the client would not be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Okay, so the client must have 5 or more of those symptoms for at least 2 weeks at a time. Now, that might go on for a month, that might go on for 6 months, that might go on for 1 year. But eventually, that episode must end in order to meet the spirit of major depressive disorder. Now, 6 weeks later, after that first episode has ended, 2 years later, 10 years later, 30 years later, doesn't matter how much later, another episode can happen. So you see how the client takes periods of going through this depressive episode and then taking a break and being able to function what we would consider normally or without depressive symptoms. And then can also, they don't have to, but they can also have another major depressive episode later. And they can have multiple major depressive episodes in their lives. But the spirit of this disorder is the client experiences these episodes and takes breaks to where there's normal functioning for that client without depressive symptoms. Okay. And if that's a little confusing, reach out to me individually and we'll try to clear that up. But that's the spirit. Okay, so now that we know the spirit, we can look at the chart on page 162, and you see how on the left side there is a column that describes the severity or the course specifier, which is your typical mild, moderate, severe. And then there's also some additional options that have code numbers attached. So with psychotic features is something we can choose. In partial remission is something we can choose. In full remission and unspecified. Um, I think that we have talked about what in full remission and in partial remission looks like, but just in case, a little brief refresher. I like to think about in full remission and in partial remission the same way that I think about, well, it's very similar to a cancer diagnosis. If you think about what in full remission means for cancer, it means that there are no cancer cells present. There was at one point a diagnosis of cancer, but when someone is in full remission, they no longer see any evidence of cancer. In partial remission is very similar. At one point, there was a full diagnosis of cancer, but in partial remission means that the treatment is working because the cancer cells have lessened. Maybe a tumor has decreased in size, and there's no additional cancer present, so it's not spreading. Okay, this is very similar to when in full remission and in partial remission are used in a clinical way in mental health. In full remission in major depressive disorder, at one point the client met the full criteria of major depressive disorder. So an episode that lasted for 2 weeks and some of the other criteria that we'll talk about in a moment. But as of today, the client is not currently in an episode. So you would diagnose major depressive disorder in full remission when the client has experienced a 2 week episode of depression in the past, but currently is in one of those break periods when the client is not experiencing any depressive symptoms at all. They are fully functioning normally to them without any depression. And so if you met this person, you would never know that the client is currently depressed or would have ever been depressed in their life. But they do have that history of a major depressive episode. And then in partial remission, it's self-explanatory as well, but the client currently is not in a full major depressive episode. However, they still feel one, two, three, maybe four symptoms of major depression, like you see before you, but they don't meet the five. Or maybe they meet 5 out of 9 symptoms of this criteria, but they've only felt these symptoms for 1 week. So they don't meet the full criteria for the episode at this time. Okay. Um, And then unspecified, that's a little more complicated. It's very generalized. We usually use that when we know that the client has experienced major depressive disorder in the past, and we kind of sense that the client might be experiencing this right now, but we're just not sure. We don't want to pull the trigger and say either they're in remission or they're currently experiencing something at a mild level. So it's kind of our catch-all diagnosis for when we just don't have enough information and we want to wait it out a little while and see if it's going to go into a full depressive episode or if the client is truly in remission. So it buys us a little bit of time. Okay, so once we have selected the specifier, actually, we should do it backwards because the first thing that we want to choose is the subtype. Anytime that we're working with a diagnosis, the subtype comes first. And technically, the subtype for major depressive disorder, and this is the same with bipolar disorder, is choosing whether the client is experiencing a single episode or a recurrent episode. Now, the deductive reasoning, the ability to choose the code number, it makes no difference whether you go with the specifier first or the subtype first, but it does make a difference when you're writing out the formal diagnosis. So I'm sorry, I should have talked about that first, but we'll fix it in a minute. Okay, so we have an option to choose either single episode or recurrent episode, and this is self-explanatory too. But if this is the first um, major depressive episode that the client has experienced, or the client in their life, they've only experienced one and they're currently in full remission, not experiencing any symptoms, then we would choose a single episode. But if the client has a history of um, of experiencing more than one major depressive episode. So maybe they had a major depressive episode at 18, and then again at 20, and then again at 30, and then again at 32, then that client would have a diagnosis of major depressive disorder recurrent episodes. Okay, so just more than one. Okay, so for example, let's say that a client, like the client I just described, had an episode at 18, 20, I can't remember all the ages, but multiple. Um, and we would consider the symptoms to have been very severe. The client was not able to work, maintain a job because the symptoms were so severe. She wasn't able to maintain relationships. She had a history of self harming when she felt these symptoms. So we would call it severe. Then we would find recurrent episode and severe and figure out which code number corresponds. And if we use the ICD-10 codes, which is what most of your agencies do now or should do now because that's what insurance requires, then the code number would be F33.2. Okay, we're going to have more discussion on how to use these code numbers and specifiers, some little tricks and tips. But first, just for the sake of time, let's go over real quickly the symptoms required for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. So you have to have 5 out of 9 of the symptoms, and just to make sure we know what these look like, the first is depressed mood most of the day for this 2 week period, every day in this 2 week period. Um, I think you know what this looks like. I mean, it's a very saddened, um, down on yourself, low self esteem. The DSM actually gives examples of feeling sad, feeling empty, feeling hopeless. Um, it even other people to allows it to count when other people observe the symptoms because many times a client will come to a counselor or go to a doctor and they don't want to admit that they're depressed. So they'll say, no, I'm just fine. I'm just fine. So their self report does not indicate depression, but their body language might indicate depression, and reports from people who are close to them might indicate depression, like the client is often tearful, they're often not participating in things that we do as a group that they used to enjoy. So it is definitely okay to consider other reports from loved ones when we are considering a diagnosis of depression. It's not good to take all of those or to only go by reports from loved ones. It's very important that we see the client ourselves and talk to the client ourselves, but it is okay to consider those when making this diagnosis because many times those diagnosed with major depressive disorder are not very forthcoming about their feelings for fear of actually having this diagnosis. Okay, anhedonia. Anhedonia is my favorite clinical word. Seriously, it is my favorite. Um, I don't know why. I guess it's the silent H. I'm not really sure. But anhedonia is a fancy word that means the client is no longer interested in activities or things that used to give the client pleasure. Um, an example, my father is an excellent piano player. And one day I went to visit him and asked if he was going to be playing piano that weekend. And he said no, he just wasn't feeling it anymore. He just didn't really enjoy doing it like he used to. And of course, my counselor sirens went off, my warning lights started flashing, and I just knew that my father was in a deep depression because he didn't want to play piano anymore when that was his favorite hobby ever. But after further conversations with him, I realized that he was starting to get some arthritis like symptoms in his fingers. And so his fingers weren't as flexible. So he wasn't as good at it anymore, or he felt like he wasn't as good at it anymore as he used to be. And so he just chose not to play it because he didn't get as much pleasure out of it. That is not anhedonia. Anhedonia, I'm sorry, that is anhedonia, but that's not anhedonia as a symptom we use toward a diagnosis of depression. Okay. He chose not to play piano anymore because he wasn't as good at it. It wasn't that he was too depressed to play. It was a side effect of this beginning stages of arthritis. And it could be, um, in certain cases, we could consider that a diagnosis toward major depressive disorder, but in his case, it was not. It wasn't that he chose not to play just because he wasn't interested. It was he chose not to play because he had this medical condition that prevented him from playing at the quality that he wanted. Now, that easily could turn into a depressive symptoms if he began to ruminate on that and began to have low self esteem because of it. But in that case, it was not at that time. I hope you see the difference there. Significant weight loss or weight gain. Um, this is, let me make sure that it says it here. Um, Yeah. Just want to make sure they hadn't changed that from the DSM-4 to DSM-5. When they say in this criteria significant weight loss or gain, they are saying or meaning that the client's weight has to change either up or down at least 5% of their regular body weight. So during this at least 2 week episode, they've had to have gained 5% or more of their body weight or lost 5% more of their body weight in order to qualify as a significant amount of weight loss. Now, once again, to meet the spirit, this weight loss has to occur as a result of feeling depression, not because they were taking Adipex or any other diet drug, not because they had engaged on this new diet or exercise plan, not because they're pregnant. We gain weight when we're pregnant. um, Now, I'm not saying that depression can't happen when all of those things are occurring, but I'm saying that we can't use this weight loss symptom toward our 5 symptoms of a diagnosis of major depressive disorder if that weight loss or weight gain is explained by something other than depression. Okay. The next symptom is insomnia or hypersomnia. Insomnia is when you are unable to go to sleep, to fall asleep, or you have trouble staying asleep once you have fallen asleep. And then hypersomnia is you sleep all the darn time. And I'm a little guilty of that right now. I just cannot get enough sleep. Now let's talk about that for a second. And I know we have a couple of almost new mommies, and many of you all are parents. So those who are parents to young children, how much sleep do you get per night? And I'm guessing that that number is going to be low. Also, how many times do you wake up in the middle of the night? I'm guessing that number is going to be high. I have an almost 4-month-old son, and I average getting up and feeding him probably 2 to 3 times per night, which doesn't sound like a lot, but Pretty much what that means is I don't sleep, I nap. I take little naps along with him and wake up at night. This is not insomnia, okay? It's not insomnia, even though by definition, having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep once you are asleep, if we look at the face value definition and compare what my symptom is compared to the definition of insomnia, it would look like it's the same and it would qualify, but it's not meeting the spirit here. Okay. I um, have trouble staying asleep because I have a 4-month old that needs my attention and needs a bottle or needs a diaper change or just needs some snuggles. So that doesn't count as a diagnosis of insomnia toward major depressive disorder. You have to make sure that even though the symptom looks right at face value, we have to look deeper and make sure that it fits the spirit. Now, I'm not saying that new mommies can't have depression, and I'm not saying that they can't have some sleep issues that counts toward major depressive disorder. But what I'm saying is don't look at these symptoms at a face value level. Look deeper and make sure that they meet the spirit. Same with hypersomnia. Um, on days that, uh, like let's say that 2 or 3 days in a row, I'm up many, many hours at night with the baby. On a day that I can sleep in, I sleep hard, very hard. I could sleep 15 hours in a row very easily if I didn't set an alarm clock or if the baby didn't need me to get up again, or didn't have work. I could sleep so long. Again, that's hypersomnia if you look at it at face value. But it's not really because I'm catching up on sleep that I had missed before. It's my body kind of getting to that homeostasis equilibrium place. I'm trying to catch up on sleep. That's not hypersomnia toward a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Okay, so this video is going super long, so I'm going to quickly go through the rest. Psychomotor agitation and psychomotor retardation. These are fancy words to describe a person's bodily movements and the pace at which the person has these movements and um, just their motor abilities. So with psychomotor agitation, think about someone who's agitated. And then also think about if you have a washing machine that's not a front loading washing machine, but was it a top loading washing machine? I don't know. I don't know what it's called. But the one that opens up at the top and you look inside and you see the little thing that twists and turns and shakes up all of the clothes, that thing's called an agitator, right? And if we think about what it does, it's constantly moving, it's constantly shaking, it's constantly um, trying to spin all these clothes around. It's got a lot of stuff going on. That's what psychomotor agitation is. This is someone who constantly taps their foot. Sometimes they're nervous, sometimes they're not, but they constantly tap their foot. They constantly tap their pencil on the desk. They constantly pop their fingers or click their fingernails on the table. They move all the time, and it's almost an agitated, nervous kind of energy. This is one of the symptoms that makes it very difficult to tell the difference between major depression and anxiety disorders. Often we diagnose incorrectly between anxiety and depression. Often medical doctors, diagnose incorrectly and prescribe anxiety medications for depression or depression medications for anxiety because of whatever presenting symptom the client has at the time. So in this case, if a client is really frustrated by this psychomotor agitation symptom, all the other stuff they can handle, they don't even realize is a problem, but they have this psychomotor agitation that's bothering them. It's making their heart race. It's making them nervous. It's making everyone look at them funny in class, which is one good thing about an online program. There's lots of good things, but one in particular, you don't have to deal with the distractions of other classmates who have this psychomotor retardation symptom. All right, so this person will go to the medical doctor and just say, Doctor, I'm so nervous. I'm so agitated all the time. I constantly move. I constantly move my foot up and down. I constantly tap my fingers. What can I do? And odds are the doctor will consider that an anxiety symptom and prescribe accordingly to what you would give someone for an anxiety disorder, which would be incorrect. If they looked at the entire picture, they would see that possibly that psychomotor agitation was a symptom for depression instead of anxiety. Also, it could be the opposite. It could be psychomotor retardation. And this is slow movements, very slow, very Eeyore-ish kind of movements. If you've ever seen Winnie the Pooh, and I'm sorry if you haven't, but I have kids, so that's kind of what my television consists of these days. If you see Eeyore, you see him walking very slow. You see him taking a lot of, it takes a lot of energy for him to move. He doesn't like to move. He doesn't like to exert any energy at all. And his voice pattern, would somebody please pin my tail back on, is very slow and very labored, and it's like it takes all the energy he has to get out those words. Um, that's how this works. It's it's like the client feels like their limbs, their arms and their legs weigh 5,000 pounds, and the amount of energy it takes to raise an arm is too much to bear. I've had clients that describe the symptom as, one day I was laying on the couch and I had to pee. I had to use the bathroom. And the thought of all the energy it would take to get up and walk to the bathroom and use the bathroom and come back to the couch was so much that the client almost had an accident. And when we think about it from a non-depressive level of functioning, that sounds kind of silly. Like, come on, get up and use the bathroom. But if you've ever experienced psychomotor retardation, you understand and have empathy for that because it really is a different mindset. It really does feel like your arms weigh so much, like it's just not worth it to expend that energy to get up. The next symptom is fatigue and loss of energy. That's pretty self-explanatory. You stay tired all the time. You just don't have any energy to do anything. Feelings of worthlessness, having inappropriate guilt. You think everything is your fault. You feel guilty for having the symptoms that you do because a lot of times those with major depression miss out on family activities because they just can't get up the gumption. Use an Eastern Kentucky word there. Get up the gumption to go out and do things. The thought of taking a shower, and ladies, the thought of putting on makeup and fixing your hair, the thought of getting prepared to be in public, and then just the act of talking to people and having to have a conversation is so overwhelming and so um, just out of the realm of possibility for what that person feels they're capable of for that day. So the client feels guilty that they're not participating in those functions. The second to last is diminished concentration or increased indecisiveness. This person just has so many overwhelming thoughts going through their mind. They just don't want to have to deal with life today and make decisions. And then the last, recurrent thoughts of death. So this is someone who does have suicidal thoughts. With major depressive disorder, you constantly, every session need to evaluate for suicidal ideations. And you guys have a great class coming up that will walk you through that. One of those is evaluation. I think you have with Sue Patterson this semester if you're in the online program, or maybe you've already had it if you're out of sequence with Lindsay's face-to-face program. But uh, please pay attention when going over the suicide evaluation assessments because honestly, at an expense of sounding super corny, that's where we save lives as mental health counselors. We save lives in many ways, but that is the most common way that we save lives is by assessing for suicide, understanding how to determine when someone is at risk for suicide, and then knowing what to do, how to treat suicide, and how to follow those ethical rules for reporting and keeping our clients safe. And major depressive disorder is one of the most common disorders that we see suicidal ideations, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts with. In my experience as a counselor, I have had several clients attempt suicide. I have had a few, not a few, I've had two commit suicide. And sometimes, even when we assess and even when we determine that suicide is a possibility, it still happens. But it's important that we do everything we can to prevent that from happening because as a counselor, that is not a record that you want to have. It is very mentally painful as a counselor to have to say, two of my clients have committed suicide. Now, fortunately for me, those clients were not actively clients. when they committed suicide. This was months and years after I'd had them as a counselor. But I wish that they had continued counseling, and I wish that I could have been a part of their counseling process. Um, and there's always this thought of you wish that there was something you could do. So make sure that you work really hard to identify um, symptoms of suicide. Now, even if when the client is reporting their symptoms to you and you give the diagnosis of major depressive disorder, and even if they don't say, I have thoughts of suicide, always assess for it. Always ask because you don't want to put the idea in their head, of course, but you never want to leave the stone unturned that they were suicidal and they just didn't want to tell you, or they you didn't bring it up, so then they didn't talk about it. So it's very important. I can't stress that enough to please, please, please always assess for suicide in every session if possible when you have a client diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Okay, so this went way too long, and I'm sorry, but this is a very important disorder that we need to cover. So we're going to do one more short video that goes over the specifiers and the subtypes of this disorder, and then move on to others in the depressive section.